I am Roger Chase, and this is Living the Classical Life. Can we just try that one?
Yeah, right at the pianissimo at 16. Excited by how magical that what came before the crash. So totally didn't look at my notes.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Let's give them with a piece sort of.
Yeah. What we were talking about, the hot air balloons. Have you ever been in a hot air balloon?
Yes, once.
You have?
Yes.
Would you recommend it?
I think it's a sort of rite of passage. I think everybody should, must, yes.
Because I would be terrified out of my mind.
You need to be terrified out of your mind, and then you get up there and you discover it's so extraordinary that you stop being terrified, or you become amazed at how terrified you are, which is one step removed from being terrified.
Do you think that's anything like being on stage, where
yes,
you feel like you know it's going to be terrifying, but you know that it's exciting too?
I think something changed in my life anyway when getting on the stage, when I had to accept that getting on the stage was going to be like a sort of death, or at least an absolute abdication of any kind of control. So, what was that book that somebody wrote called The Fear of Flying or something?
Yes.
The moment of jumping out of the airplane, when, like hot air ballooning, when you take off and you've gathered your wits. In other words, you've got some fuel in the tank, you hope, and you have a rough idea which way the wind is blowing, but after that you have no conception of what's going to go on. So you walk onto the platform, and truly, no matter what kind of preparation you've done, how well prepared you think you are, actually you don't know what's going to happen at all. You have a rough idea. I don't think that sort of control is within our grasp, actually, under those circumstances. You get used to it, so familiarity breeds something similar, not contempt, of course, but some kind of familiarity with perhaps one's own nervous state. Mm-hmm. But I don't think you can ever say you have absolute control. Actually, I think it was Radu Lupu who said something like, for the first 20 performances of a concerto, anything can happen. I thought, well, he's lucky to have 20 performances of a concerto, of course. But
that's absolutely amazing. I mean, that reminds me of Joseph Hoffman. He said, we think of him as being the veteran performer because he was touring America from the age of 7 or 8. Right. And he said about any new concerto that he was learning, I don't expect miracles of myself the first 5 times that I'm performing a piece. After that, maybe something can happen. But until then, it's just procedure and you're just trying to hang on.
Yes, but then what do you say? Okay, he wanted miracles. Do you ever get rid of your own frustration after the first 5 performances, to take him as an example? Do you get rid of your frustration, or do you have to live with it for the rest of your life? That nothing is ever going to be as perfect as you dream that it should be.
I think the latter is the case. I don't think I always want more.
Right.
But I do think that this sense of reaching for more makes the few moments that actually seem to work all the more transcendent for me.
Okay. On the whole, I find that my imagination is in front of where I find myself, which is a source of frustration. But it was a very great friend of mine, a film composer, who said to me, Roger, if you want to be involved with the arts, he said, you better get used to being frustrated for the rest of your life. To a degree, I think he's right. Somebody came up with that comment of Richter the other day as well. Richter said something like, wasn't he asked to tell somebody about a performance that he was truly happy with, and he thought for about 10 seconds, and eventually he said, I can think of no performance that I was truly happy with. So I think that sort of frustration, a little bit like if I say to my students, you know, if you ever walk in here and tell me you're playing in tune now, that's when I start getting worried. Meaning that they will have stopped listening hard enough. Mm-hmm. Comparing with what they do with what they are listening to in their heads before they start playing.
There have been periods in my life where I was very dissatisfied with my performances, and I think that was partially a function of my musical aspirations had eclipsed my ability to reach them. So it took time to work up from that plateau to reach a little closer to what I was trying to reach.
That is so interesting. I think that must be true, that when you discover a certain self-acceptance, then probably you're going to find that progress is easier. But how to find that moment of self-acceptance? You know, I think most of us have in our lives somebody who the French call le grand autre. This was told me by a really wonderful French artist who told me that in his life there was such a person. And I could immediately think of who that person or those people might be for me. And I wonder whether most of us have somebody, the big other, we might call it, that other person for whom we're continually trying to perform, trying to seek approval of, from that other person. And until we actually accept the fact that we will never get their approval, because it's a construction of our minds, of course, that this perfection as we see them, this person that we can never be as good as, until we reach that point of understanding we can't do it, then probably we cannot accept ourselves, which means we cannot actually begin to have a proper relationship with ourselves on the platform, and therefore be complete enough to maybe, on our very finest days, give somebody in the audience something of a cathartic experience, so they walk out of the concert hall in a changed state, somewhere having developed something in themselves which they did not have at the beginning of the concert, having found something for themselves.
Do you find that sometimes, in fact, your more successful performances can be the ones where you are trying less and something just happens of its own accord? For me, that's the case.
Yes.
If I'm trying so hard
Yeah.
to make something happen in one particular way, first of all, I put limitations on what kind of magic can happen because I'm so pointed in one direction.
Yes, yes.
But if I try less, usually, or if I care less,
I think I would use the second of those, that not caring so much in a positive way. On the surface of it, it seems like a negative. It seems like like an interesting way of avoiding a problem. It's not that at all. It's a question of, not caring. I have a more flowery way of saying it, actually, which I shan't repeat now. Yeah. But I think it's extremely important.
Yes.
It amounts to saying, none of this matters, at least not in the way that I think it did before I got onto the platform. Actually, none of that matters. To whom does it matter? Does it matter? Does anything matter? You know, we're little pinpricks of matter in the unimaginable vastness of, even compared with the sun. You know, what is going to happen is going to happen.
It seems like you've always done things your own way.
And got into terrible trouble for so doing.
I mean, was it that way from an early age? Actually, I don't know what age you started playing.
Yes, I was always something of a rebel. It's taken me a long time to stop hurting myself in that way, because of course the only person to suffer from my rebellion was myself. Of course, in the end, I started playing the violin a little bit when I was 5 years old, and when I was 9 years old, I had a viola put under my jaw by my father. But before the age of 5, I was a late talker, but it was said that I could sight read on a recorder before I could talk. I don't know if that's true or not, but I certainly remember picking up something when I was 2 or 3 years old and
Yes.
teaching myself to read music, which is actually terribly simple. You know, reading music. If you're tiny enough, it's the most wonderful graphic that we ever invented, and incredibly simple to read if you start. You know, when the brain is like that wide open sponge, and you look at something and you remember it, and you can never forget it. You know, I really do think that all kids should actually learn. I'm sort of slightly arguing against another philosophy here, of course, which is where people suggest that you should learn to read when you want to read and all those. But actually, if you give a kid something that they're interested in, they can learn it incredibly quickly. It's very, very simple to read, how to read.
Actually, I'm curious to know, what age were you when you started? I couldn't find this anywhere.
On the viola, I was 9 years old, but I had been playing the violin since I was 5. Prior to that, I think the first instrument I picked up and blew was probably actually a Salvation Army cornet. And I did manage to get a sound out of it. But I taught myself to read music by playing the recorder. Very, very early.
Whose idea was it to start music?
You see, I don't know, actually. It would be very easy to say my father, because he was a passionate amateur. But I can't be sure that that's why I did it. I'm quite certain that he had some ambitions for his children, his son, my sister. Because if he could have formed a string quartet at home, I'm sure he would have been absolutely thrilled to bits, but he couldn't because he only had 2 children, so that meant that he had to be a trio, my mother not being a musician. But I think he would have wanted us to. But my suspicion is, though, that something was going on before that. And I have a suspicion that in order to survive our families, we do what is necessary. And I'm not saying this is negative.
Yes.
I think it's just how it is. You know, if there's only water to drink, then you'll learn to love water. So I think I was hearing music at home. My father, being the amateur musician, would have his friends around. And so every time little Rog went to bed, there were these strains of music coming up the stairs. Some of it not bad, actually, looking back on it. I think there were some really wonderful people that came into my house to play with my father. But so I suspect that what's going on there is that we learn a sort of language at a very early age. We do an ordinary language, and we resonate with it. It means something to us. It has an emotional impact. So when we finally play, even if we are persuaded to play, that's putting up with a very gentle word on it, persuaded to play by our parents, or it might feel forced to play by our parents. But the fact of the matter is that we are being told to do something which uses a language which we already know. My father was, to me at any rate, it felt he was a fearsome disciplinarian. And I think I can safely say that I was frightened of him until I was 13. Some of my older friends would say it was tantamount to abuse. You could speak to somebody of a generation younger than me now, and they would say, "What?" They wouldn't believe some of the things that happened. But of course, corporal punishment was a perfectly reasonable educational tool at the time.
Well, of course, I mean, overbearing fathers in musicians' lives, that's
Yes, there are some.
totally, there are quite a number of stories like that, Paganini, Mozart, Beethoven.
There are some serious precedents, there's no question about it. No, but if I tell people how my father, for example, tried to instill a proper left-hand technique into me, incorporating a thumbtack and some plaster, some plastic tape, yes, so that I skewered myself if the hand position wasn't right and things like that, you know. But did it work? Well, you could say it did work. The interesting thing to me is, or for example, when I'm thinking of something else, when back in the day when we were supposed to hold the violin without the use of the left hand, he said at one point, take your hand away from the instrument. So I did, and of course the instrument fell to the floor and the fingerboard came off and there was tremendous splintering of wood. But I wouldn't have dreamt of not doing what he told me. So there was that fear. But despite this fear, I couldn't possibly, I was unable to stop listening to music. We had a record collection, and I have powerful memories of my putting my ear next to the loudspeaker in order to sort of to catch the crackle of the cannon in the 1812 overture or whatever it might be, that sort of thing. Of being absolutely riveted, my hair standing on end, thrilled by the sound of this stuff. So despite everything my father did to put me off it, he couldn't have succeeded, you see. It was already there. But the rebellion, I remember the rebellion quite vividly before that, even with the National Youth Orchestra. I didn't want to spend my holidays sitting in an orchestra, even a fabulous orchestra. I resented the discipline that was imposed in the orchestra of the type, for example, we had to lie down and rest for an hour in the afternoon from 2 o'clock or something like that. This sort of thing. Yes, I know it seems sort of quite extraordinary now, but bearing in mind that I've been going away and sort of sleeping in tents with my mates from about the age of 7 or 8. So at the age of 13, to suddenly be told that I had to go and lie down and sleep for an hour at 2 o'clock, sorry, I'm not going to do that. So I wanted to have a better time. So for my I stayed there for 2 years in the orchestra, and then I left because I preferred to be cycling my bicycle around the fabulous countryside of the UK or something like that.
I'm trying to get a sense of how you, as a solo violist, as a soloist, decided on that freelance lifestyle as opposed to, well, I know that you've been part of many ensembles, you've taught many places, you've worn many hats, you were principal guest violist in many of the world's major orchestras, including at Berlin. Perhaps you even had offers from these orchestras as such that you didn't accept.
I did.
Why did you choose to be a soloist?
I don't think I did choose to be a soloist. I think that came later. I think the problem for me was that I was very, very bad, going back to the rebellion thing again, I was very bad at being told how to play. I wanted to find out for myself what happened if I did this, or if I did that, or if I read the piece of music and I saw that it would be lovely if it might be persuaded to go in this direction or that direction. And I simply wasn't very good at sitting in an orchestra and being micromanaged through every second of my working life, which to a large extent I think describes the life of an orchestral musician. And I should add to that I have enormous and never-ending respect for my orchestral musician colleagues, because they can do many things which I am not very good at. I've survived in that world by bringing a different attitude to it, which some people have found useful and worthwhile and not indictable. But my nature is not good at that. My nature is that I want to sit down and play a wonderful piece of music and find out what happens. Can I make it do this? Will it accept that? Isn't it extraordinary that I can see this correlation or that possibility, this sort of thing? I'm just interested in exploring it myself. The trouble for a violist is, of course, that the repertoire doesn't exist for you to do that particularly satisfyingly. Unless you're playing in a chamber music group, where of course you have the pillars of our civilization, So playing in a chamber group was probably what I was going to be most satisfied doing for a very, very, very long period of time. But of course then you have fights, then you have arguments.
That's right.
But there are incredible ways of learning. They used to say that if you want to become adept at international diplomacy, there's no better training than to sit in a professional string quartet for 4 years, and you'll learn every skill you need to know to sort of solve the world's problems. And I think there's a huge amount of truth in that. So even in a chamber group, I could have difficulty because I still wanted, I suppose I didn't want to be a leader. I just couldn't help wanting to find out what happened if if I could put my idea on it.
Yes.
And there's a great colleague of mine once said, Tony Pay, the fabulous clarinetist, he said to me, Roger, he said, let's face it, he said, you haven't got enough notes to make it go where you want it to go, as a viola player, you see. So there was a difficulty there. You know, I think I have a huge limitation. And I don't know whether this comes about as a result of having played from such an early age. But it takes a huge amount of me, my intelligence, my physical ability or lack of it, talent, or lack of talent, to actually do what I want to do on the instrument. Mm-hmm. It takes such a huge effort that to be asked to do something now which does not take that effort makes me feel as though I'm only half alive. So I'm really caught between the devil and the deep blue sea here. I'm sort of damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. If I give it everything I've got, I feel alive, and it might not earn me a living. If I do what I'm told to do, then it feels as if I'm only half connected to it, and then I find it almost impossible to play. In other words, if I'm not fired up by my whole self, it doesn't work. It's impossible for me, I wouldn't say impossible, but it becomes incredibly difficult to make a sound. So I think there is something in this, of what you're saying, even with Kleiber. There's a point at which you can't, I'm trying to find an analogy, you can't, a cat knows how to be a cat. It cannot be anything else other than a cat. You can't teach a cat tricks very, very easily. It won't do that for you, but it will be a cat perfectly. So I'm not saying I can remotely that I can be as perfect as a cat, but I think I understand the difficulty that a cat has in being asked to do something which is not cat-like. And I fully accept that that's a limitation on my part.
But what I'm trying to get a sense of is whether being a rebel, in fact, could be a sense of liberation for me and my colleagues in conservatory.
Right.
We feel that we have to pass certain landmarks, certain milestones,
Yes.
competitions, recognitions, management, recordings.
Yes.
And if we don't do those things, somehow being a musician is not possible. But somehow you've always done things your own way and succeeded.
You know, Zsolt, I've been unbelievably lucky, and I'll say something about that luck, in that I was lucky to be born at a time which allowed me to mature, not putting too fine a point on that word, because I'm sure I wasn't, but to become employable, let's say, at a time when there was a reasonable amount of money sloshing around for many, many people to get work who might otherwise not have got work, if I move that into present day circumstances. But you raise another point which I think is critical, and I think it speaks of art and what art is and what it's for. And I think the problem that we have at the moment is that everything has become, if I say corporate, this is such an overused notion, overexpressed notion, I know. But the problem is you can't, I don't believe you can measure art. So we might have had competitions that were set up between Chopin and Liszt and that sort of thing.
That's right.
But that wasn't measuring in the same way. These two people were making a gigantic contribution to the planet Earth, whether they wanted to or not. They simply couldn't help it. It was as if somebody came along and chose them. They were forced to do it. I don't think art can be turned into something which you can buy and sell and measure in the same way. In fact, as soon as you do, I think really for me it ceases to be art. I think music in people's lives operates on a different level to that. And the problem is we're not very good at allowing that, because we have decided that it should be possible for people to earn a living doing it. And the trouble is, 'twas never thus, except for the very, very few. Let's take, Mozart as a good example. Yes. But we also know that or Beethoven. I mean, these people were not living in the lap of luxury. They never could, and that's why they were railing against the aristocracy, the patrons, and so on and so forth, forever. And and the entrance was via the kitchen.
Yes,
it was ever thus. So the thing is, we rightly want to have a decent living.
Yes,
we want to be able to put food on the table and have our glass of wine and have our vacations and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, every time we make ourselves more comfortable in that way, there is a risk. I'm not saying that, I'm not going to predict that we lose something which is absolutely essential to the existence of what we're talking about, but there's a risk that we will. There's a great risk that something which is essential to the life of the art itself is going to disappear. Fact of the matter is that when you and I sit down working on a little piece by Schubert, we are not thinking, I know this for a fact, yes. We are not thinking about whether we can afford dinner tonight.
Yes.
We're not. In fact, we're almost using it so that we don't have to think,
right,
can we afford dinner tonight?
Although maybe in certain circumstances that could lend a certain urgency to play for one's next meal. For artists to become too comfortable.
But this is the nub of it. If you are only playing, I think, if you are only playing in order to get your next meal, while you are playing, if you are thinking about the next meal, you're not going to be producing something which is worth listening to. I'm sorry. At least, I don't believe it. I cannot do it. Well, all the necessary circuits, for me at least, I cannot speak for everybody else, for me at least, are switched off. It becomes something, suddenly my arms start to ache. Suddenly I can't hear the intonation properly anymore. Critically, I'll be frustrated as well, but I can't hear it. I can't do it. My sense of rhythm goes nowhere. I suddenly become angry with myself, and I don't know where the anger comes from. I become depressed, fabulously depressed, and I don't know how to get rid of the depression.
So in fact, when you're performing, you're thinking on higher levels. I mean, I think there was a story that the Ukrainian pianist, Ignaz Friedman, who was performing in Paris, he was looking into the skies, and then a lady afterwards said, "Oh, Mr. Friedman, oh, it was rapturous when you were looking into the ceiling. What were you thinking of?" And he said, "The hotel bill." But if that were really my answer, I don't think I would be operating on the level needed to create Friedman's magic, which obviously there was magic.
Yes. I doubt it as well.
Yes.
I doubt it as well. And in fact, there's a wonderful story about an ex-principal cellist of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra who walked off the platform and resigned. And when asked why he resigned, he said, "Because I've just spent my first concert thinking about something other than the music. I therefore resign."
Well, now that's artistic integrity.
It was, wasn't it?
My goodness.
Yes. But I don't know whether he felt, therefore, that he was playing badly or not. But that was his decision. But I just know that personally, I can't do it if I'm thinking about everything. Therefore, there are certain forms of work which for me are very difficult. However, going back to your question about the students and how they are supposed to be measured, survive, not survive in this way, my feeling is that this business is full of opposites which are so difficult to reconcile. But I think part of it must be a sense of commitment to yourself, that you retain some kind of self-integrity, regardless of the games that you might have to play in order to survive in the society. And I think you also need to know that if the dice do not fall your way, I mean, you could say this is mere sort of intellectual sophistry, that you're just playing games with yourself. But I think you have to say, if it doesn't fall my way, it's not my job. If you believe that you do truly have something to offer, if you believe that, if you know that deep inside yourself that you do have something to offer of integrity, and if it doesn't fall your way, the job doesn't fall your way, the audition doesn't fall, the competition doesn't fall your way, it does not mean to say that there is not going to be a place for you. I have to believe that, because otherwise most of us can go and throw ourselves in the lake tomorrow. And that cannot be true. I won't accept that. There is a purpose for each of us, for you, for myself, for these students. It might be a purpose which is not what they think it is at the moment. But if they are allowed to keep that sense of personal integrity and not be cowed by that, the competition result, I think they will find a life which works for them, which gives them purpose, which allows them to function and contribute, and therefore be fulfilled. I'm not even saying be happy, because that's a dangerous one, you know.
Yes.
The pursuit of happiness. Actually, that doesn't cut it for me entirely. I don't totally believe with our I can't remember the man's name now, was it Bentham? Was saying about that, the pursuit of happiness. It's too simplistic, way too simplistic. I mean, if I was trying to look for happiness when I'm practicing and struggling, trying to achieve something, I would immediately stop practicing. That's not the happiness we're talking about. Contentment or a fascination or a thrill of noticing a tiny little bit of progress in one's playing, what one's doing, that can give you a sense. Happiness, not really the right word.
In the face of all these challenges that we discuss and try to transcend, what keeps you going? When are you most content, on stage or off stage?
You know, it's very interesting to me that if I answer that question honestly, I would say that I can relate very easily to what one of my other teachers, Bernard Shaw, said. You know, when things get really tough in life, and they do for everybody. There's nobody who's going to have a life on planet Earth who isn't going to find life tough sometimes. He said, when life gets really tough, he said, you have no idea how lucky you are to be able to go into a room by yourself, spend a couple of hours struggling with a problem on your instrument, alone, and come out after 2 hours having achieved something, just for yourself. And I've never forgotten that, and I think he's right. For me, whether I'm employed or not, I doubt that I will ever stop picking up that box of wood and grappling with it, because I think I can say already several times it saved my life. I think that's really important to remember. The other part of it is going onto a platform. Are you going to be happy? Are you going to be satisfied with what happens? Are you going to be thrilled? At the age of 23 or 4, I think I remember seriously realizing that there has to be some point in all this terrible effort and self-scrutiny and agony and loneliness. Let's not forget the loneliness of the practice room, because it is profound. There has to be some point to this which is bigger than myself. Otherwise, I just can't see what for. I'm not getting enough out of this for my own personal happiness. There's got to be a bigger reason for this. Therefore, the bigger reason is you're going to have to do it for something else. You're going to do it for the happiness of the people who are listening.
Finally, how do you find inspiration on a daily basis? It was Tchaikovsky who said he could only write when he was inspired. He said, therefore,
you can't.
Yes.
I don't think you can. I think anybody who says they can find inspiration every day is lying. I think what happens is, as another friend of mine said, you have to build your house strong enough so that it will withstand the fire of inspiration, and you never know when that fire of inspiration is going to strike. So what you do is you build and you build and you build and you build with all the intelligence and heart and soul and nerve and sinew you have, but you don't know whether you will be inspired, because that's something different altogether. I don't, in other words, believe in inspiration as the reason that we can play here today. That was not inspired. What were we doing? We were working. That's not inspiration.
Yes.
So we need to know that the fruits of our labours, our work, is going to be there even when inspiration is not.
Thank you so much for being here, Roger.
Thank you very, very much.
Such a pleasure to have you on.
And to play with you as well.
And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was fun.
Yes.